In the middle of the gala party, the millionaire's son began to writhe on the floor and stopped breathing. All the guests thought it was an attack, frozen with fear. That's when the new cleaning lady ran to help him. Then, in front of everyone, the father saw the woman do the unthinkable. She stuck a sharp object into his son's neck. The scene left everyone in pure shock, and the father ran towards her, certain he was witnessing a murder. But what he heard next was not a scream of pain, but the sound of his son drawing breath, breathing again. The gleam of the crystal chandeliers reflected off champagne flutes and expensive jewelry. But for Arthur Vance, the host, the light felt cold and distant, unable to warm the void that had settled in his soul since Clara's passing. The black-tie gala at his sprawling estate was a spectacle of opulence, an ocean of silk dresses and hushed conversations about leveraged buyouts and the latest swings on Wall Street. Every smile he offered his guests was a well-rehearsed mask, concealing the knot of anxiety that chewed at his chest. His eyes, however, did not linger on the faces of the magnates or the elegant figures gliding across the floor. They searched incessantly for a small blonde figure running through the gardens, the only anchor holding him to reality, his son, Leo, his immense fortune, a global portfolio built on audacious technology investments and an infallible nose for promising IPOs, seemed utterly insignificant compared to the fragility of that small life. To the world, Arthur Vance was a billionaire, a man whose wealth was measured in digits most people would never conceptualize. But, in his heart, he was just a father, a terrified widower. Since losing his wife, his entire universe had contracted to protect the boy, and that protection had a name, a constant threat that loomed over every sunny day. Every park visit, Leo's severe allergy to bee stings. The image of a single sting was a recurring nightmare, a shadow that haunted him. This made the gala, with its doors opening onto the blooming garden, a profound test of nerves. He watched from the terrace, heart pounding, as Leo, under the watchful eye of the nanny, laughed and chased light reflections dancing on the lawn. His son's laughter was the only melody that mattered, the only real prophet in his life of numbers and figures. He allowed himself a brief moment of peace, a sigh that seemed to relieve an invisible weight from his shoulders. Leo was happy. He was safe. Maybe he could relax, just for an instant. The garden, with its carefully pruned rose bushes, Clara's favorites, was a sanctuary of beauty and, at the same time, a veritable minefield. Arthur diverted his gaze for a second, forced to greet a senator who approached with a fawning smile. The conversation was a blur of words about capital gains, dividends, and the crypto market, but his mind was outside. He recalled the promise he'd made to Clara on her deathbed that Leo would always be his priority, his most precious asset, the living inheritance of a love death couldn't erase. He abruptly excused himself, the knot of dread tightening, and returned his gaze to the garden. That was when he saw it, a small yellow and black spot hovering lazily near a rose, mere inches from his son's curious hand. The air fled his lungs. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into infinite agony. He started to move, a silent scream caught in his throat. Too late. A sharp, frightened cry pierced the air, tearing through the soft melody of the string quartet and the murmuring of the guests. Leo dropped to his knees, his little hand flying to his neck. It was only an instant, a blur against the boy's pale skin, but Arthur knew. His whole world stopped spinning. The sharp sound tore the air, and with it, the veneer of polite society shattered. Arthur heard nothing else. The murmurs of the guests, the soft music, everything dissolved into a distant, terrifying hum. He ran, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that stole his breath. His feet, clad in expensive Italian dress shoes, sank into the soft grass, each stride an eternity. His entire empire, his holdings, his financial assets spanning continents, nothing mattered. In that moment, he was just a father running toward his greatest treasure, which was in danger. When he arrived, the scene before him was the materialization of his worst nightmares. Leo was on the ground, his face already starting to swell, his lips acquiring a frightening blue tint. A horrific wheezing escaped his throat with every desperate attempt to pull air. His eyes, wide with panic, met Arthur's, a silent plea that broke the father's heart into a million pieces. The nanny, Amanda, a young woman who had come with the best references, stood beside him, but her reaction was useless. She was shrieking, a senseless, high-pitched sound, her hands fluttering like frightened birds. "Where is the injection? Where is it?" Arthur roared, panic turning his voice into thunder. The guests had approached, forming a circle of silent horror. These were the city's most powerful people, men and women who controlled fortunes and decided the fate of massive deals. But now they were only paralyzed spectators, their pale faces illuminated by the soft lights streaming from the mansion. Many mistook the reaction for a sudden seizure or fit, and the fear of the unknown petrified them in place. The nanny's reply came through hysterical sobs, each word a stab to Arthur's chest. I think it stayed at home, in the other bag. Oh my God, I forgot." The confession hung in the air, dense and suffocating, forgotten, a mistake so banal, so stupid, that it would cost his son's life. Arthur's world collapsed. The strength that had propelled him vanished, and he fell to his knees beside Leo, despair engulfing him like a cold wave. He held the boy's small hand, already losing warmth, and felt the life draining out of him. In that instant, he would have traded every cent of his net worth, every share, every Bitcoin, for a single, simple gulp of air for his son's lungs. It was then that, from the periphery of his tear-blurred vision, he noticed movement. It did not come from the circle of frozen guests. It came from the terrace. A woman, dressed in the simple uniform of the cleaning crew, had just set aside a cloth. Her name was Helena Reed, and he had barely noticed her before. But now, she moved with an urgency and purpose that cut through the paralysis of the environment. Her eyes showed no panic, only fierce concentration, assessing the scene with a speed Arthur couldn't comprehend. She circled the group of shocked onlookers, her step firm and decisive. Arthur watched her approach, a stranger in the midst of his private hell, and a wave of confusion and rage swept over him. What could a cleaner possibly do? He opened his mouth to shout, to order her away, to push her away from his agonizing son. But before any sound could escape, she was already kneeling on the other side of Leo, and her eyes met Arthur's with an unwavering authority that silenced him. Time seemed to fold in on itself, every second an agony. Helena did not waste an instant on the hysterical nanny or the circle of pale, shocked faces. Her eyes, a deep and surprisingly calm bluish, were fixed on Leo. With one hand, she gently tilted the boy's head back, exposing his small, vulnerable neck. With the other, she opened a small canvas pouch attached to her uniform belt, a personal, usage-worn first aid kit. Arthur watched her, his mind a whirlwind of denial and panic. What did she expect to find there? A Band-Aid, an aspirin. Anything she pulled from that pouch would be a futile gesture, a cruel mockery in the face of the unfolding tragedy. His own private physicians, the best in the country, were a phone call away, but time was a luxury they didn't have. Every cent of his money, every asset, felt useless and powerless. Then he saw her pull out two objects that chilled his blood, a common blue plastic ballpoint pen and a small, almost utilitarian folding knife with a short, shining blade. For an instant of pure horror, Arthur's mind refused to process the image. This made no sense. It was a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by desperation. He felt a surge of protective fury rise in his throat, a primal roar. This woman, this complete stranger, was about to desecrate his son with objects so mundane and yet so terrifying. He prepared to leap upon her, to tear her away from Leo, to protect his boy from this madness. The business world had taught him to be ruthless, to crush any threat to his portfolio. Now, his most basic instinct screamed for him to crush the threat to his most precious inheritance. But her speed was supernatural. Before he could move, she dismantled the pen with a dry click, discarding the ink cartridge and retaining only the hollow plastic tube. Her fingers, agile and precise, found a specific spot on Leo's neck, a small depression in the cartilage. The gesture was so clinical, so certain, that it paralyzed Arthur for a fraction of a second. There was no hesitation in her touch, only the certainty of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. And then, in front of everyone, under the golden light of the late afternoon, the blade flashed. She made a small horizontal cut, precise and swift. Arthur finally found his voice, a raw cry of pure agony and disbelief that echoed through the silent garden. "What are you doing?" he bellowed, surging forward, panic finally breaking his paralysis. Helena did not turn to him. She blocked him with a firm arm, her eyes never leaving her task. Her voice, when she replied, was not a scream but a command, laden with an authority that silenced not only Arthur, but everyone present. "He isn't breathing. It's a cricothyrotomy." The technical word, so out of place coming from someone in her uniform, hung in the air, dense and incomprehensible. In the same instant, she inserted the plastic pen tube into the small incision. A deadly silence fell over the garden. No one breathed. All eyes were fixed on the blue pen protruding from the boy's neck. Life and death seemed suspended in that moment, in that deafening quiet, waiting for a single sound. Arthur's cry was suspended in the air, dying in his throat. The entire universe seemed to hold its breath along with him. The silence that followed was absolute, so profound that Arthur could hear the frantic drumming of his own blood in his ears, a frantic counterpoint to the terrifying stillness of his son. His eyes were fixed on the blue pen, a profane, surreal object sticking out of Leo's skin. The woman, Helena, remained motionless, her hand firmly holding the small tube in place, her face a mask of impassive concentration. Arthur felt hatred and fear merge into a paralyzing emotion. He would kill her. If Leo didn't breathe, he would destroy her. All his power, all his immense fortune that could move mountains and influence governments would be channeled into a single purpose: the annihilation of that woman. He, the billionaire accustomed to having absolute control over his businesses and cash flow, was on his knees in the grass, utterly powerless. And then the sound came. It wasn't a gasp, nor a choke. It was a faint, almost imperceptible hiss, a fragile, hesitant sound, like the first cry of a newborn. It was the sound of air forcing its way through the plastic tube, the sound of life refusing to give up. That tiny noise cut the silence like the most powerful thunder. Leo's chest, which had been dangerously still, moved. A minuscule movement, almost a vibration, but it was there. It rose and fell once, and then again. The blue tint on his lips began to recede, slowly giving way to pale pink. Arthur couldn't believe it. His eyes, which had been burning with rage, now filled with a different kind of tears. Tears of a relief so overwhelming it was almost painful. He would have given all his gold, every dollar and euro in his accounts, just to hear that faint, wheezing sound. That sound was the most valuable asset in his universe. A collective sigh ran through the circle of guests, a sound of relief that seemed to break the spell holding them. The statues of horror turned back into people, blinking, murmuring, looking from the child on the ground to the woman in her simple uniform with a mix of astonishment and admiration. Who was she? How did she know how to do that? Helena, however, seemed oblivious to everything. Her eyes did not leave Leo for a second, her expression still tense, monitoring the boy's fragile breathing, adjusting the angle of the tube with millimeter precision. She acted not like a heroine, but like a technician performing delicate, crucial work. Arthur looked at her hands. They were not the hands of a housekeeper. They were firm, competent, the hands of someone who knew the anatomy of life and death. He, whose advisors spoke daily of interest rates, dividends, and the growing value of his investment funds, realized that the only profitability that mattered was his son's breath. The rage he had felt for Helena dissolved, replaced by a confusing, overwhelming emotion he couldn't name. It was gratitude, yes, but it was more than that. It was a deep, almost reverent admiration. He, who lived in a world where a person's value was measured by their net worth, had judged this woman by her clothes, by her job title, and she, with nothing but a utility knife and a ballpoint pen, had given him back his world. As he processed this seismic shift in his perception, a new sound began to infiltrate the garden atmosphere. Distant at first, but growing in volume with every passing second. It was a sharp, insistent sound, a melody of urgency approaching rapidly. Sirens, help was on the way. But as Arthur looked at the brutal, improvised procedure on his son's neck, and then at Helena's calm face, a new kind of fear enveloped him. What would the paramedics say upon seeing this? Would they see a savior or a madwoman who had mutilated a child? The sirens grew from a distant wail to a penetrating howl that seemed to shake the rose bushes in the garden. Two paramedics burst through the side gate, bringing with them the aura of calm competence Arthur had desperately wished for. The team leader, an older man with a face etched with experience, assessed the scene with a quick, trained eye. The circle of rich, helpless guests, the sobbing nanny on the ground, and finally, the boy lying on the grass with the strange apparatus in his neck. His eyes narrowed. Arthur felt his heart sink. That look was not one of relief. It was of suspicion, of shock. The fear that had assaulted him moments earlier returned in full force. Had Helena, in her desperate attempt to save Leo, caused even greater damage? Had she crossed a line that would land her in trouble, dragging Arthur into a legal and ethical nightmare? He was a businessman, accustomed to calculating risks and liabilities, and the sight of the improvised procedure suddenly seemed like a catastrophic liability. "Step away from the child, ma'am," the paramedic said, his voice firm but not aggressive. He knelt beside Leo, his partner opening a large equipment case. Arthur held his breath, expecting the explosion, the accusation. He prepared to intervene, to use his name, his influence, to protect the woman who, regardless of the outcome, had acted when everyone else froze. But Helena didn't move. She merely raised her eyes to the paramedic and said, with the same calm authority as before, "His airway was completely obstructed. Anaphylaxis from a bee sting. I performed an emergency cricothyrotomy with a pen tube to restore breathing." The explanation was so clinical, so precise, that the paramedic paused for an instant, his hand hovering over his instruments. He looked again at her work, this time not with shock, but with professional scrutiny. He checked Leo's pulse, observed the slight rise and fall of the boy's chest, and listened to the small hiss of air passing through the tube. The silence stretched for a long moment. Arthur felt as if everyone's fate was being weighed on that scale. The paramedic then looked up and directly at Helena. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something Arthur could only describe as astonishment and profound respect. "You saved his life," the man said, his voice low and sincere. He turned to his partner. "Prep the intubation kit, but be careful. Upper airway must still be severely swollen. She bought us time." And then, looking back at Helena, he added, 30 more seconds and he wouldn't have survived. The brain wouldn't have held out. The phrase was both a sentence and an absolution. The weight in Arthur's chest broke, replaced by a wave of gratitude so intense his legs felt weak. He had to brace himself against a marble statue to keep from falling. The paramedic was right. It wasn't about shares, treasury, or inheritance. It was about seconds. 30 seconds separating his life from complete ruin. While the medical team worked efficiently, stabilizing Leo and preparing him for transport, Arthur watched Helena. She finally stood up, retreating to give the professionals space. Her posture was not triumphant. There was a tiredness in her shoulders, a shadow in her eyes he hadn't noticed before. She seemed to want to disappear, to blend back into the shadows of the terrace, as if heroism was a burden she did not wish to carry. She wiped her bloodied hands on the rough fabric of her uniform, a simple gesture that struck Arthur as the most profound and meaningful thing he had ever seen. She had saved his son's life and was now simply cleaning her hands. In that moment, the nanny, Amanda, who had watched everything with eyes wide with horror and guilt, rose and ran, not toward the boy, but away, disappearing inside the mansion, her sobs echoing behind her. Her flight was a silent confession, but Arthur barely noticed. His entire universe was focused on the quiet woman standing on the periphery, the unlikely savior wearing a cleaning uniform. And a question began to form in his mind, a question that eclipsed all others. Who was Helena, truly? The ambulance departed, carrying Leo and a stunned Arthur, who refused to leave his son's side. The flashing lights and the diminishing siren left behind an awkward silence in the mansion garden. The party was over. The guests, previously engrossed in conversations about high-yield investments and the future of the crypto market, now dispersed in small groups, speaking in shocked whispers. The drama they had witnessed was more real and visceral than any stock market fluctuation. They cast furtive glances at Helena, who remained near the terrace, a solitary figure amidst the abandoned opulence. She had begun methodically collecting her cleaning supplies, as if trying to restore order to a world that had just been turned upside down. To the guests, she was an enigma. The housekeeper who quoted emergency medical procedures, the woman who acted with the surgical coldness of a trauma surgeon. The mystery surrounding her was the only topic that could compete with the shock of the incident. Helena felt the stares, but did not lift her head. She preferred the comfort of her routine, the simplicity of her tasks. The adrenaline that had sustained her began to subside, giving way to a familiar tremor in her hands. She clenched her fists inside the rubber gloves, trying to control the reaction. They were the ghosts, the echoes of a past she was desperately trying to keep buried. The sounds, the smells, the urgency of life and death. It all came back in moments like this. Cleaning houses, scrubbing floors was her form of penance, her method for silencing memories of other places, other times where blood and despair were the norm, not the shocking exception at a garden party. She didn't want to be a hero. Heroism was a heavy word, stained with loss and sacrifice. She just wanted peace. Inside the mansion, Amanda, the nanny, cried uncontrollably in one of the luxurious bathrooms. Guilt was a poison in her veins. She was young, a little careless, and the glamour of the job had dazzled her. She wanted to impress, to look sophisticated, and the large, practical bag where she kept Leo's EpiPen didn't match the dress she had chosen for the party. It had been a stupid, vanity-based decision. A decision that had nearly cost a child's life. The paramedic's phrase echoed in her mind, 30 more seconds. She knew her career, perhaps her life, was ruined. How could she face Arthur again? How could she live with the memory of Leo's bluish face? The weight of her negligence was more crushing than the loss of any fortune. Meanwhile, in the ambulance, Arthur held Leo's hand, now connected to monitors emitting rhythmic, reassuring beeps. Color had returned to the boy's face. His breathing was stable, aided by oxygen. Arthur's panic had transformed into cold, cutting clarity. He thought of Amanda, the nanny. Rage was a hot ember in his chest, but beneath it was a layer of his own guilt. He had hired her, trusted her. Had he been negligent? Had the vastness of his businesses and the management of his capital distracted him from his most fundamental responsibilities as a father? The question tormented him. And then his mind turned to Helena, the image of her kneeling on the grass, the calm in her eyes, the precision of her hands. It was an image that would be imprinted on his memory forever. She was not a housekeeper, or, if she was much more than that. He needed answers. He needed to understand who this woman was who had emerged from the shadows to give him back his son. The gratitude he felt was so immense that it felt like a new kind of wealth, an emotional asset he barely knew how to manage. As soon as Leo was safe at the hospital, he would return and he would find Helena. The hospital was a world apart, a sanctuary of antiseptic smells and quiet efficiency. Leo was taken to the pediatric ward, where a team of doctors awaited him. Arthur, relegated to the waiting room, felt stripped of his power. Here, he was not the billionaire whose decisions influenced the market. He was just another distraught father, waiting for news. The hours dragged on. He made calls, cancelled board meetings, put his vast empire on hold. Nothing mattered except the beeps of the monitors he could vaguely hear down the hall. Finally, a doctor came to him. Her words were the most precious balm he had ever received. "He's stable. The intervention was remarkable. Whoever did that on site saved his life. Without a doubt. He will be kept overnight for observation. But a full recovery is expected." The relief was so absolute that Arthur felt tears stream freely down his face for the first time since Clara's death. He spent time by Leo's bedside, watching his son sleep serenely, the only sign of the trauma being a small bandage on his neck. Arthur's heart swelled with a gratitude so profound it was almost physical, a force that reconfigured him internally. He kissed the boy's forehead and made a decision. Leaving Leo in the care of the hospital's best team, he returned to the mansion. The house was silent, the remnants of the party already cleared by a staff working with discreet efficiency. But he wasn't looking for order. He was looking for the woman who had created chaos to restore life. He found her in the back kitchen, finishing cleaning the last counter. She stood with her back to him, her uniform now pristine, as if nothing had happened. "Helena," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She turned, and for the first time he saw her face without the mask of urgency. It was a face marked by fine lines of tiredness around the eyes, but it possessed a strength and dignity that the simple uniform could not hide. There was an old sadness in her gaze, a wisdom that belied the job she performed. "Sir," she replied, her voice neutral, respectful. "Your son, is he well?" The genuine concern in her question disarmed him. "He's fine," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to you." He paused, trying to find the right words. "I don't know how to thank you. Money, anything you want. Shares, gold, just name it." He was offering a piece of his fortune, a gesture that in his world resolved everything. Helena looked at him, and a weak, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "I don't want your money, sir. I'm just glad the boy is all right." Her simple refusal, the dignity in her response, caught Arthur by surprise. In his universe, everything had a price. Every favor expected a return, a profit. Her refusal was a turning point, an anomaly that profoundly intrigued him. "But who are you?" he asked, curiosity overriding decorum. "How did you know what to do?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the dark window. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. The ancient sadness in her eyes deepened. "I'm nobody important," she began to say, but was interrupted by one of Arthur's security guards, who rushed into the kitchen. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the police are here, and they want to speak with her." Arthur spun around, his heart chilling. The police? Why? The guard looked from Arthur to Helena with an expression of confusion. "They mentioned something about an open arrest warrant." The word police echoed in the immaculate kitchen, as misplaced as the pen in Leo's neck. Arthur's mind, a machine finely tuned to calculate risk, assess investments, and predict stock market movements, simply couldn't process this new, shocking variable, an arrest warrant. Why? A speeding ticket? An old debt? The possibilities racing through his head were banal, logical, within the spectrum of problems that money could easily resolve. He turned to Helena, expecting to see the same confusion, the same indignant denial he felt, but her face told a different story. There was no shock. There was a quiet, hollow resignation, the acceptance of a long-avoided fate, like a debtor finally hearing the creditor's knock. In that instant, he knew this was no mistake. Her tranquility was more terrifying than any panic. Two uniformed officers entered the kitchen, their heavy footsteps breaking the stillness of the mansion. They were professional, their faces impassive, but their eyes couldn't help but register the opulence of the setting before fixing on Helena. "Ms. Helena Reed?" asked the older one, his voice respectful but firm. Arthur stepped forward, instinctively positioning himself between them and Helena. "I'm Arthur Vance. This woman is my employee, and she just saved my son's life. This is preposterous. There must be some mistake," he declared. His voice weighted with the authority of a man whose businesses and capital influenced economies. He was accustomed to having control, to seeing people bow to his authority. The officer was not intimidated. He consulted the tablet in his hand. "There is no mistake, sir. We have an open warrant. Helena Reed, accused of desertion from military service, declared 10 years ago." The word hung in the air, more shocking than any charge of common crime. Desertion. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in Arthur's mind with painful clarity. The calm under pressure, the specialized medical knowledge, the lethal efficiency with which she had acted, and the sadness in her eyes, the ghosts she tried to silence. They weren't ghosts of a simple life, they were specters of war. The housekeeper in his kitchen wasn't just a housekeeper, she was a soldier who had run. Helena closed her eyes for a brief moment. The long run was over. For 10 years, she had lived in the shadows, changing cities, changing jobs, using only her first name, an anonymous existence to keep the past at bay. Cleaning other people's wealth was her camouflage, her way of becoming invisible. She never imagined that her training, the very skill that haunted her, would be the cause of her ruin. Saving a life had exposed her. Arthur looked at her, at the vulnerability that now cracked her facade of strength, and felt a surge of protective fury. He had built an empire, a vast fortune, to insulate himself and his son from the harsh realities of the world. Now, he was about to use every ounce of his power, not to generate profit or dividends, but to protect the woman who had become the most unexpected and valuable asset in his life. "She's not going anywhere," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. He picked up his phone. "My legal team is en route. Nobody leaves this house until they arrive." The officer hesitated, visibly uncomfortable, challenging a man of Arthur's caliber. He exchanged a look with his partner and, finally, nodded. "We'll wait. But we can't leave, sir." Helena opened her eyes and looked at Arthur, and there was no gratitude in her gaze, only a deep, sorrowful warning. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You don't know what you're getting into." The kitchen, minutes earlier, a refuge of domestic tranquility, had now transformed into a crisis room. The air was thick with a tension that not even Arthur's vast wealth could dissipate. Helena remained silent, a statue of resignation, while the two officers kept a respectful distance, clearly intimidated but unyielding. Her phrase, "You don't know what you're getting into," echoed in Arthur's mind. It was a warning, but also a challenge. He had spent his whole life getting into complex situations, high-stakes negotiations, transforming liabilities into assets with an almost alchemical skill. To him, every problem was an equation waiting to be solved with the right resources, and he possessed almost limitless resources. His empire wasn't built on luck, but on the relentless application of capital and strategy. This situation, strange as it was, would be no different. He saw her as an investment, the most important of his life, an investment in the woman who had given him back his sole true inheritance, his son. The arrival of his lawyers was like the charge of the cavalry in expensive suits. There were 3 of them, led by Mr. Wainwright, a grey-haired man whose mind was one of the sharpest in the corporate legal world. They were accustomed to dealing with mergers, acquisitions, and the complexities of the stock market. Not charges of military desertion. Arthur met them at the kitchen door, their faces a mixture of confusion and readiness. "Mr. Wainwright," Arthur said, his voice low and controlled, "that woman saved my son's life. She is being accused of desertion. Resolve this. I don't care about the costs, the resources, or what it takes. Just resolve it." The order was absolute. Mr. Wainwright merely nodded, his eyes quickly glancing at the officers and fixing on Helena. He saw what Arthur saw, not a criminal, but an anomaly. The lawyers, with polished efficiency, isolated the situation. They escorted Helena and the police to the vast mahogany library, turning the reading room into an improvised law office. Arthur was left behind in the now silent kitchen. He began to pace, the adrenaline of protection replaced by a cold anxiety. He looked through the window at the dark garden where his son had almost died. What was desertion compared to saving a life? In his business world, the profitability of an act defined its value, and Helena's act had had an infinite, immeasurable profit, not counted in dollars or euros. He realized, with an uncomfortable clarity, that he lived in a gilded cage, a world where the power of his net worth shielded him from the rougher edges of life. Helena came from a different world, a world with rules and consequences he could barely imagine. And, by intervening, he might have dragged her out of her safe hiding place, exposing her to dangers he himself didn't understand. After nearly an hour, which felt like a decade to Arthur, Mr. Wainwright returned to the kitchen alone. His face, usually a mask of unwavering confidence, was grim. He closed the door behind him, a gesture that indicated the gravity of what was to come. "Arthur," he began, using his first name, something he only did in the most critical situations. "We managed to postpone detention for tonight, with the guarantee that she will present herself tomorrow. But I need you to understand the situation. The charge is serious, and her history, it's complicated." Wainwright paused, choosing his words carefully. She wasn't a simple soldier. Helena Reed was a combat medic, one of the best, and she didn't disappear during leave. She vanished in the middle of a war zone, during a mission that went terribly wrong. She is accused not only of desertion, but of abandoning her post in combat. Mr. Wainwright's revelation hit Arthur with the force of a punch. Abandoning her post in combat. The phrase was heavy, laden with implications of cowardice, betrayal, and dishonor. It was a concept so alien to his world of contracts, cash flow, and civilized negotiations that he struggled to comprehend it. The image of Helena, calm and precise under the most extreme pressure, simply did not fit the narrative of a deserter fleeing danger. His instincts, honed by years of reading people across negotiation tables, told him the story was far deeper and more complex. The desertion was a fact on paper, a legal liability, but the motive, the reason behind it, was an informational asset he desperately needed to acquire. He wasn't just trying to save an employee. He was trying to understand the woman who, in a few minutes, had redefined the meaning of courage and value for him. After the lawyers and police departed, the mansion sank into a thick, uncomfortable silence. Helena sat at the kitchen table, an untouched cup of tea between her hands. The facade of resignation had cracked, revealing a vulnerability that made her more human, more real. Arthur sat across from her, not as the owner of the house, but as a man searching for answers. "Why?" he asked softly, the simple word burdened with the full weight of his confusion. "Why did you run?" For a long moment, she didn't reply. She just stared at her own hands, as if reading a story there she didn't want to tell. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper, haunted by memories that time had failed to erase. She took him back to a dusty desert, to an improvised medical outpost amidst the chaos. She described the exhaustion, the endless flow of wounded, the constant fight to mend shattered bodies with limited resources. War, she said, wasn't about heroism. It was about trying to maintain humanity in a place that had none. She didn't speak of herself as a hero, but as a mechanic, fixing what she could. Her voice grew even more strained as she described the fateful mission. Her unit was ambushed. Communications were cut. The commanding officer, a young and inexperienced man, panicked and gave a terrible order: retreat and abandon the most critically wounded to save those who could walk. For Helena, that was a violation of everything she believed in, a betrayal of the oath she had taken as a medic. She refused. While the rest of the unit retreated under fire, she stayed behind with 3 severely wounded soldiers, men she knew wouldn't survive without immediate help. She dragged them into a ditch, using her own body as a shield, and worked feverishly under crossfire to stabilize them. "I didn't abandon them," she said, and for the first time raised her eyes to meet Arthur's. There was a raw pain and a righteous fury in her gaze. "I did my job. I saved the lives of those 3 men, but when the dust settled and reinforcements arrived, I was the only one who had disobeyed a direct order in combat. Officially, I was a deserter." She knew she would be subjected to a court-martial, that the complexity of the situation would be lost in the name of military discipline. So, she did the only thing she could to survive. She disappeared. She became a ghost, trading her scalpel for a mop, silencing her past so she could have a future, even if it was a future in the shadows. Arthur listened, his heart tight in his chest. The woman before him was not a coward. She was the opposite. He had amassed a fortune, a wealth the world admired. But Helena possessed a different kind of asset, an integrity that had led her to sacrifice everything, and in that moment he realized that her battle had only just begun, and that he, with all his resources, was now at the center of it. Helena's story hung between them in the stillness of the kitchen, a truth so raw and heavy it seemed to have its own gravitational pull, sucking all the air out of the room. Arthur looked at the woman before him and truly saw her for the first time. He no longer saw the housekeeper, the accidental hero, or the fugitive. He saw the embodiment of an integrity that he, in his entire life of business and capital accumulation, had rarely encountered. His vast fortune, an ocean of assets and investments spanning the globe, suddenly seemed superficial, almost vulgar, compared to the wealth of character she possessed. He had built an empire on the premise that everything and everyone had a price, a value that could be measured in dollars or shares. Helena was living proof that he was wrong. What was the value of her sacrifice? What was the profit of her honor? There was no financial metric for it. He stood up and began to pace the kitchen, not out of anxiety, but from a newfound energy, a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Helena's defense was no longer an act of gratitude. It had become a moral necessity, a cause that gave new meaning to all his power. Fighting for her was the only application of his net worth that felt truly significant. He stopped and turned to her, his eyes burning with a determination that made her flinch slightly in her chair. "They are wrong," he said, his voice low but resonating with the authority of a man who bent the world to his will. "The system is wrong. A man gave a cowardly order, and you made the correct decision, the only human decision. You are not a deserter. You are a hero, and the world is going to know it." Helena shook her head, a gesture of weariness and disbelief. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You can't fight the military. It's an institution, a machine. They won't admit they made a mistake. They'll crush me, and if you stand in the way, they'll try to crush you too. Your reputation, your businesses." Are you going to risk everything for someone you met less than a day ago? She looked at him as if he were insane, unable to grasp the futility of that fight. For her, who had spent a decade hiding, the idea of facing the machine head-on was unthinkable. She had learned the hard way that justice did not always prevail. Arthur offered a dark smile, a glimpse of the relentless predator who had made him a billionaire. "They can try," he said. "My reputation was built on turning the impossible into profit. My businesses are rock solid. They think they have power. I have a different kind of power. Money might not buy honor, but it buys the best lawyers, the best investigators, and media attention. It buys a chance to fight. And I never enter a fight I don't intend to win." He leaned across the table, the proximity charged with an intensity that took her breath away. His eyes held no pity, but a fierce partnership, an unwavering promise. "We're not just going to defend against the charge, Helena. We're going to prove your story. We are going to find the 3 men you saved." The audacity of the statement shocked her into silence. Changing the strategy from defense to offense was an unbelievable power move, an all-or-nothing bet that could either redeem her or destroy them both forever. What followed was a demonstration of power Helena had never imagined possible. Arthur didn't fight with weapons, but with the resources of a true billionaire, and he mobilized his private army with stunning speed and efficiency. His mansion, once a place of silent opulence, transformed into a command center. The best lawyers in the country, led by Mr. Wainwright, occupied the library, plotting complex legal strategies. In the ballroom, a team of elite private investigators, ex-federal agents and intelligence specialists set up an improvised office, complete with whiteboards, maps, and timelines. The cost of the operation was astronomical, a capital drain that would make any other businessman hesitate. But for Arthur, it wasn't an expense. It was the most critical investment of his life. Every dollar spent was an application toward justice, whose profitability would not be measured in dividends, but in the redemption of an honorable woman. Helena watched everything from a stunned distance. Arthur had installed her in a luxurious guest suite, insisting she stay in the mansion for safety. It was a gilded cage. She spent her days wandering the silent corridors, feeling like a ghost amidst the focused commotion. The scale of Arthur's wealth and power was overwhelming. He spoke on the phone with senators, newspaper editors, and retired generals with the same ease he discussed cryptocurrency market fluctuations with his brokers. He was moving mountains for her, and the immensity of his effort was both terrifying and deeply moving. At night, when the house quieted, they would meet in the kitchen. These were whispered conversations, where the barriers between the billionaire and the former combat medic dissolved. He spoke of Clara, of his loneliness. She spoke of the faces of the soldiers she couldn't save. In those moments, they weren't defined by their assets or their pasts, but by a human connection forged in trauma and hope. However, the military machine was a formidable adversary. Time passed, and the investigation to find the 3 soldiers Helena had saved seemed to hit a wall of silence and bureaucracy. Records were sealed, names were common, the men seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. The date of the preliminary hearing approached like a storm cloud. The military prosecutor presented a seemingly irrefutable case. Testimonies from the commanding officer, communication logs, Helena's own decade-long absence. Everything painted the picture of a deserter. Hope began to dwindle, replaced by the harsh reality that perhaps not even Arthur's vast fortune would be enough. The day of the hearing arrived, cold and grey. The military courtroom was an austere place, devoid of any comfort. Helena, in a simple suit bought by Arthur, felt small and exposed. Arthur sat behind her, a solid, unshakable presence, though she could feel the tension emanating from him. The prosecutor, a woman with a piercing gaze and an immaculate uniform, presented the case with brutal, dispassionate precision. Fact after fact, evidence after evidence, She built an impenetrable wall of guilt around Helena. The judge looked at Helena with a severe expression. The air in the room was heavy with the inevitability of conviction. Mr. Wainwright looked grim. He rose to begin his defense, but it was clear to everyone that he had little to fight with. Hope had died. It was at that exact moment, when the courtroom silence was absolute, that the back door creaked open. One of Arthur's investigators rushed in, his face flushed with exertion, his eyes shining with urgency. He ignored the furious glare of the judge and went straight to Arthur, whispering something in his ear. Arthur tensed, his eyes widening in shock and then in radiant disbelief. He leaned forward and whispered to Mr. Wainwright. The lawyer, in turn, seemed to grow 10 years younger. He turned to the judge, his voice resonating with a new and powerful confidence. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call a surprise witness, a man who traveled all night to be here, retired Sergeant Miguel Costa." A murmur ran through the court. The prosecutor rose to protest, but the judge, intrigued by the sudden change in atmosphere, motioned for her to be silent. "Let the witness enter," he ordered. The back door opened again, and a middle-aged man walked in, visibly limping on one leg. He wore a rumpled suit that couldn't hide the strong constitution of a career military man. His face was a roadmap of scars, and his eyes swept the room before fixing on Helena. In that instant, time stopped for her. She recognized him, not the older, weary man before her, but the young soldier whose chest she had patched up under a rain of dust and bullets. The air fled her lungs in a choked sob. Arthur placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, an anchor in her sea of emotions. Miguel Costa walked to the witness stand and took his oath, his voice firm and clear. Mr. Wainwright approached him. "Sergeant, can you describe the events of May 16th, 10 years ago?" Miguel looked directly at the military jury members, men and women whose faces were masks of neutrality. "We were ambushed," he began. His voice weighted with memory. "It was chaos. We were getting massacred. I was hit and 2 of my men were down." He described the order to retreat, the officer's decision to abandon the wounded. "We were dying. We knew it. We had accepted it. And then she refused." All eyes turned to Helena. "The medic," Miguel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "She disobeyed a direct order to stay with us. She dragged us into a ditch while the world exploded around us. She used her own body to shield us. She had next to nothing in her kit, but with what she had, she worked miracles. She kept us alive. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for her. None of us would." "And where are the other 2 men she saved, Sergeant?" Wainwright asked. Miguel took a deep breath. "One of them, unfortunately, passed away 2 years ago, from complications related to his injuries. The other one, he's waiting outside." It was the final blow. The prosecutor looked pale, her case crumbling before her eyes. Mr. Wainwright called the second witness, a man in a wheelchair who corroborated Miguel's every word. The story was no longer about desertion. It was about a heroism that defied orders to honor a higher duty. When Helena was called to testify, she didn't need to say much. The truth had already been told by the men whose lives she saved. She merely looked at the judge and said, "I am a medic. My duty is to save lives, and I would do it all again." The verdict was swift. Not guilty on all counts. The word echoed through the courtroom, and the room exploded in murmurs of relief. Arthur hugged Helena, an embrace that was not that of an employer to an employee, but of 2 souls who had crossed a war together. Outside, in the sunshine that seemed brighter than ever, Helena was greeted by the 2 soldiers. The embrace between the 3 was silent, weighted with a decade of pain, gratitude, and survival. The nanny, Amanda, who had been located by Arthur's investigators, was also there. With eyes red from crying, she begged forgiveness from Arthur and Helena. Arthur, softened by the ordeal, found no room in his heart for anger. He dismissed her from her duties, but ensured she had support to deal with the trauma of her error. Her dismissal was not an act of vengeance, but a natural consequence of broken trust. As he watched Helena talking to the men she saved, Arthur realized that the resolution of that conflict was not only legal, it was the resolution of a debt of honor, a restoration of faith in justice. And he felt something new blossom in his chest, the realization that the greatest wealth was not in his assets, but in the deep, unshakable connection he had forged with the extraordinary woman beside him. Life after the court did not return to normal. It transformed into something entirely new. Helena's story, discreetly bolstered by Arthur's influence in the media, became a symbol of courage and integrity. She was no longer a fugitive, but a reluctant hero, besieged by interview requests and book deals. However, she refused everything, preferring the silence and peace that had been denied her for so long. Arthur's mansion, once a temporary refuge, became her home. Her presence filled the opulent corridors with a warmth and simplicity that money could not buy. She and Leo developed a deep bond, a mixture of affection and reverence from the boy, who understood, in his childish way, that this woman had given him the gift of breath. Arthur watched them together, and the void left by Clara began to be filled not by a replacement, but by a new form of happiness, a happiness built on the foundation of a shared crisis. The overwhelming gratitude Arthur felt for Helena matured, transforming into deep respect and, inevitably, love. It was a different love than he had known with Clara, less about the carefree joy of youth and more about a reverent admiration for Helena's strength, resilience, and unyielding heart. He fell in love with the woman who, with a ballpoint pen and steely courage, had opened a path to air and life, not just for his son, but for him too. He, the man who commanded a business empire, found himself humbled before her, learning that true wealth lay not in his assets, but in the capacity to love and protect those who are precious. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, watching the stars, Arthur made a proposal. It wasn't a marriage proposal, not yet, but something perhaps deeper. "Your skill saved my son," he said. "But what happened to us was luck. Luck that you were there. No one else should have to depend on luck." He proposed they join forces. He, with his capital, his influence, and his organizational ability. She, with her practical medical knowledge and her understanding of real life under pressure. Together, they created the Lifeline Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to training laypeople in emergency procedures, from basic first aid to more complex techniques, like the one Helena had used. They wanted to empower ordinary people to act, to fill the crucial seconds between an accident and the arrival of professional help. The foundation was a resounding success. Helena, who had hidden in the shadows for so long, found a new purpose, not as a war hero, but as a teacher, sharing her knowledge to save countless lives. Arthur, in turn, discovered a new form of investment where profit was counted in stories of survival and cash flow was measured in gratitude. They built a future together, not from the ashes of a tragedy, but from the triumph over it. Their love, forged in the most terrifying moment of their lives, was solid and profound, a partnership of equals who admired and completed each other. The black tie gala that nearly ended in disaster became the catalyst for a new life for everyone. And Arthur Vance, the billionaire who thought he had everything, finally understood what true wealth was. It was looking at his family, the incredible woman beside him, and the son laughing in the garden, now free from fear, and knowing that this was the only treasure, the only inheritance that truly mattered.